about Cenk Uygur and about Bernie Sanders retracting his endorsement. We discussed in the fun half some of the things that we found problematic with the things that Cenk has said in the past. He's apologized for those things. We had different discussions about that. But the gist of what we were talking about in terms of the New York Times, which is, I think, indicative of a major problem at the Times, was that they had presumably, I don't know, there was a Twitter account that has really gone ballistic. In a way that I've very rarely seen such vigorous research done by an amateur Twitterer. It's almost impressive in terms of the relentlessness and also the disingenuousness. They cut a clip of Cenk Uygur with David Duke, where David Duke was saying, "I'm not racist." And Cenk said, "Right, you're not racist." And the New York Times reported that as Cenk Uygur agrees that David Duke is not racist. When in fact, with any context, and maybe just even watching that video without it being in context, it's quite clear that Uygur is being what is known as sarcastic. Sarcasm is this very, very nuanced new form of communication that the New York Times may not be aware of. Anyways, they were informed that there is this new methodology of registering disdain called sarcasm or facetiousness. And they added a correction to the piece that, of course, nobody goes back and reads, right? I mean, back in the day, if you issued a correction, the way that people read newspapers was like, I read Monday's paper and then I read Tuesday's. And on Tuesday, I see, oh, there's a correction. But what they do is they just attach it to Monday's paper, as if people go back and, you know what, I read that thing about Uygur yesterday. I think I'm going to read it again just to see if there's a correction.
Yeah, I bookmark my articles just so I can go back.
And this is the correction. An earlier version of this article referred imprecisely to a remark by Cenk Uygur, a radio host who is running for a California congressional seat. When David Duke, the white supremacist, appeared on his show and denied being a racist, Mr. Uygur was replying sarcastically when he said, "No, of course not." Now, I want to be clear on this. Imprecisely is doing a lot of work there and is a very, very loose term. I mean, it's sort of ironic that imprecisely could be used in such an imprecise way. Because to report this as Cenk Uygur was agreeing with David Duke that he's not a racist, when in fact it turns out that Uygur was sarcastic, in other words, ironic, in other words, saying, no, of course not, as in, of course you are. It is literally precisely 180 degrees from what the reality of that exchange was. And then, of course, like I say, they do this on the piece which nobody goes back to. The only people who will know about this correction are people who are probably already in some way sympathetic or aware of the mistake in the first place, because all those people who just read it casually, they're not going back.
Also, super small point, but I think illustrative. Being a radio show host is totally honorable and great. And if they respected somebody, and if it was somebody else, they would say, like, I don't know, media entrepreneur,
former MSNBC host.
MSNBC host. I mean, it's just such a condescending BS way of describing all of the guy's accomplishments. The disdain and disingenuity still shines through.
I would argue that actually it's not so much about condescending. It is about, I think, anyone with any type of savvy knows that the people in that district who are going to vote for a Democrat do not listen to talk radio shows because there are none for them. And that had they said former MSNBC host, that would have made a much different impression on people. Yes,
Absolutely.
You could have put entrepreneur. I mean, they own the biggest, yes. But it's a very odd moniker. He has not been on radio for at least a decade, as far as I can remember. Like at one point they were on Sirius XM, and that's the way the show launched. But he hasn't been on it for, I think about a decade.
The largest progressive radio show or progressive show on the internet.
Right.
But I think, and also I just would like to make a brief, I watched Anna's coverage of this yesterday on the Young Turks, including, by the way, all the other stuff that people dredge up and go over again and again and again, which range from either maybe, like a genuine mistake ages ago that the guys apologized for, or either just like hosting a radio show and having a different sense of humor, which I think people need to get real about, or another actual smear, like video of Cenk saying, yes, the Armenian genocide happened. I'm sorry I wrote something obnoxious when I was in college and I grew up in a propagandized household. Of course it happened. And people tweet at me this nonsense when I go on there whenever. It's ridiculous. And I really would watch Anna's segment. It's quite well done.
All right. So that's that. Just wanted to get that out there because, of course, many of you probably don't go back and read the same articles twice.
I think the only time I ever see a correction is if I'm late to read something.
Right. Well, of course.
I was like, oh, this came out a week ago. I'm glad I caught the correction.
Right. Exactly. The New York Times is telling you that the way you read their paper is you wait 3 or 4 days and then read it.
It's like buying a new gadget.
And it's either malicious or they're hiring some of the dumbest people on earth. I'm sorry. That's my editorial.
It's malicious people.
There is no way that you... if you watched that interview and reported it that way, then you have basic comprehension problems that would rule you out for a high school newspaper. This
is a failure of the editors, too, in a big way. Like, they didn't come across as like, wow, that's weird for a progressive guy, for a guy who's a progressive host to sort of to agree with David Duke. That strikes me as odd. Maybe we should double check that. No, but it probably makes total sense.
Let's be real. There's a lot of insane people out there who identify on the center or however they identify themselves that actually would basically equate criticizing President Obama's offer to cut Social Security with liking David Duke. So there is a very demented wing out there.
All right.